Hi, I'm back again, and this is the fourth lecture that we have, a fourth session, if you will, of this week. I hope it's been a good week. I know that this is a new experience for a lot of you, never taken an online class before. It's a new experience for me. I've taught an online class before, but this is my first asynchronous class where we're not meeting live, but rather uh, recorded. But I am really enjoying the discussion threads, and I encourage you to make sure you go through those. I'm asking that you, for each of those discussion threads, you make at least one response to me, directly to my question, and then a response to one of your fellow classmates. You're more than welcome to post much more than that. I love that, as a matter of fact. Um, and those discussion threads are really about giving you a chance to offer what you think a little bit about the things we're talking about, the things that we'll be reading and are reading, and things that your classmates are saying. Today will be part two as we look at Gilgamesh and at Genesis. And I'm going to say right now, it looks like I'm going to continue discussing Genesis and Gilgamesh into the start of next week. So make sure that if you haven't read all of Gilgamesh, that you do so. And I would also encourage you to read the first 4 chapters of Genesis. Now, if you're interested in a unique take on Genesis, then I would encourage you to go to the translation that I have given you in your syllabus, and it's located there somewhere around page 40 of your syllabus. And this is a translation that I did when I was in graduate school. This was my master's thesis. I translated Genesis from Hebrew to English. And if you'll notice, it seems a little different. It's a very literal translation. And my committee, when I worked on this translation, told me to, whenever I come to a place, a fork in the road, where the translation possibilities could go more than one direction, they wanted me to always go the road less traveled by. We'll talk about that on beginning of next week. But instead, I want to just kind of focus my effort on what you have read in Gilgamesh. But before we do, I want to talk about mythology and myth. We're going to be using that expression a lot in this class, and I want you to note this, if you will. When I use the word myth, when literary critics and scholars use the word myth, they don't mean it in the same way that we often mean it when we use it in just regular conversation. Because if someone says in regular conversation, well, that's a myth, what they usually mean by that is it's not true. It's a fib. Something like the show that used to be on called Mythbusters. That is not what we're talking about when we talk about myth. When we use the word myth, it has nothing to do with whether or not it's true or untrue. But rather, we're going to think of a myth as a story that's so culturally significant that it's impossible to separate the culture from the story and the story from the culture. The two are so intertwined, and it has nothing to do with whether or not it's true. For example, I would argue that the central myth of Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I, as a Christian, believe absolutely that that's true. But it's still our central myth, because if you take that story away, and that's what myth actually comes from. It comes from the Greek word mythos, which just means story. If you take that story out of Christianity, the entire edifice of it falls apart. That makes it our central myth. Now, this is an interesting point too. You can always tell if a myth is a living myth or a dead myth. The way you tell is, does the myth have attached to it ritual. You see, all rituals are reenactments of a myth. Um, I would argue that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a living myth because we have attached to it ritual that reenacts that myth. Every time we take in communion, we're actually reenacting that myth. We take in the bread, which is his body, and we take in the cup, which is his blood. Now, this is really amazing. What Jesus did here is so spectacularly awesome. You see, here he is on the upper room, and he's celebrating with his disciples a ritual that goes with the Jewish central myth. Because if I had to pick the central myth of Judaism, it would be the Passover. And it's a beautiful story, of course, where the children of Israel are being saved, and not only from the Egyptians, but they're being saved from the angel of death. And by putting the blood on the door, the angel of death would pass over them. And then there was this feast that they would eat. That's the feast that Jesus and his disciples are about to take part in. Jesus is saying, though, this is no longer going to be your central myth. From now on, there's going to be a story that matters to you more than even the Passover. And it's going to be my death and resurrection. And the same ritual that we have had attached to the Passover will now be attached to that story. So take this bread and remember me. And take this cup and remember me. Now, I believe it's a true story, but it's still a myth because we can't separate the culture from the story and the story from the culture. There are also national myths, and attached to them are often rituals. So, for example, on 4th of July in the United States, we will go out when the sun goes down to watch fireworks. And what are we doing there? Well, we're actually performing a ritual. We're reenacting a central myth, an important myth to the United States, and that is the War of 1812 and the War of Independence. Now, most people are there just looking at pretty fireworks saying, ooh and ah. But I hope this 4th of July, you'll look up and realize I am celebrating a ritual. I am reenacting a very crucial myth in the story of the United States, and that is the War of Independence. Although I would not argue that that is our central myth. I would say our central myth is the Civil War. That story is where we, as a United States, gained our true identity, really the completion of the War of Independence. And before that war, we would say the United States are going to do something. After that war, we would say the United States is going to do something. Really a central story. And we have reenactments, which shows you that it's a living myth. Now, Zeus and Apollo and some of the Greek myths are wonderful stories. I love them. But I don't think I would argue that they are living myths, not because they're uninteresting, but because there are no active rituals attached to them. As far as I know, there aren't very many people reenacting the myth of Zeus or Apollo or Athena or Aphrodite. Maybe at Berkeley, where I used to live, there were some weird people probably doing something like that, but not very widespread. There were also family myths, and I bet you have them. In my family, I remember when I was a kid, we were celebrating Thanksgiving, a wonderful myth, and a true story, by the way, a wonderful story and a myth. But we were celebrating, and my mom put out a paper tablecloth and with the full Thanksgiving spread. And she loved to put these little tea candles in front of each plate and light them. My sister, who at the time was about 10 years old, thought it would be fun to tear off a piece of the paper tablecloth and to light it on fire. And of course, it immediately erupted into flame, and she dropped the paper, and it had set the whole table on fire. My dad grabbed the extinguisher, put it out, ruined much of our meal. It wasn't funny at the time, but we sure laugh about it now. To this day, that's an important story to my family, and we have a ritual attached to it. You see, my mom still will put out a beautiful spread, but she'll put the little tea candles out in front of every table, and she'll light every one except for my sisters, who my sister is almost 50 years old. I don't think there's a risk that she's going to light the table on fire. However, it's a wonderful way to reenact that story. So when we talk about myth, I want you to think of it that way, as a crucial central story that really helps define the culture. And it's hard sometimes to tell which came first, and it's hard to just separate them. They're just too connected. Now, Gilgamesh is clearly the central myth of the Mesopotamian peoples. Now, this would be the region that is today the modern-day Iraq. This is the area that would later on become Babylon. This is the area that Abram and Sarai and his nephew Lot came out of. God called them out of the city of Ur to come out. And as we talked about in our last session, that is probably where the story of Gilgamesh may have had its origins. Now, the story is complex, despite seeming simple at first, and it tells about the adventures of this king Gilgamesh. And I'm just going to assume that you've already read the epic, so I'm going to make some commentary on it. And I want to talk first about the portion of the story that I am sure was very, very shocking to some, because it's a little sexual, a little risque. Because we have the story of the gods recognizing that the king Gilgamesh is too powerful by himself to go unchallenged, that there is an unbalance in the world. And so they need to have someone else to come and bring balance, which immediately makes me think of a very modern myth, Star Wars, where you have an imbalance in the force, all the power is on the dark side, and then you have another character like a Luke Skywalker must rise to bring balance. So the gods realize that there is an imbalance, and so they create Enkidu, who's a wild man, and he's running with the animals, and he's every bit as strong, maybe stronger than Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, though, is very intelligent. He realizes if he goes up against Enkidu, he might very well lose. So he needs to get an advantage. And his way of getting an advantage is he's going to tame him. And he's going to tame him by giving him an encounter, if you will, a sexual encounter with Shamat, the sacred temple girl. And it's a very explicit scene. And we never know whether Shamat's very excited about being used in this way. But I'm just going to start right here. It's actually on page 31 of your syllabus. Again, you're probably very shocked at the size of the syllabus. And that's because I've given you all of your handouts. One thing you might want to do is just print the whole thing out, hole punch it, and put it in a binder if that works out for you better. That gives you all of the handouts. I like that better sometimes because I can read it in bed or wherever I am. But here's the encounter here, and I'm just going to read it and make comment on it. So here, column 4 says, "The beast stirred then, stretching and shaking their heads. The man beast stirred then, stretching and shaking his head." Of course, the man beast being Enkidu. He's coming out of the woods, just like the wild animals. And Shamat looked at him and smiled. Shamat smiled as a smithy smiles at the finest tools. Shamat's sacred temple girl smiled at the raw material for her civilizing art. I like that idea of this wild, uncivilized man as something that needs to be temper, something that needs to be shaped. One thinks of a growing boy, one thinks of a teenager, if you will. Shamat spoke in a passionate whisper. Here is he, wild in form, a form needing my fire to make it a civilized form. I shall show him my body. I shall let him smell my exciting musk. I shall cover his body with my body. I will heat his hammer with my burning bush. I will raise his trembling hammer. I will let it beat my anvil womb and show him my civilizing force. I will change his scent from wild to tame, and his herd will flee. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. That's a very graphic, poetic, in some ways, dare I say, beautiful way of describing the sexual encounter here. So they have this encounter, and you can read the encounter that is graphic, even though it's 4,000 years old. I think it's still a little shocking. And they have this little rendezvous that goes for about 7 days. So this is not just a one-night stand. And when it's done, notice right here, I want you to notice right here, Enkidu, having had this encounter with the woman, Enkidu now could no longer run and run. And Enkidu now was no longer wild. Enkidu is now no longer a virgin. Enkidu now returned to Shamat to learn more of civilizing ways. And Shamat said, now that you have learned one civilizing way, I will teach you others. And Shamat taught Enkidu how to dress. Shamat taught Enkidu how to eat. Shamat taught Enkidu how to speak fine and clear. Shamat taught Enkidu how to listen when someone speaks. Enkidu, during the day, did learn these civilizing ways, and during the night did continue to practice these civilizing ways. So you get an idea that now Shamat has gone from the sexual partner to now the teacher of the almost a motherly figure, if you will, teaching him these civilizing ways, how to dress, how to walk, how to speak, learn how to use tools. She'll teach him how to use weapons. And the question I threw out there is, are women a civilizing force on men? Because I actually think that this very old poem is hinting at some truths, as all great sublime pieces of literature do. They speak to a larger truth. And the larger truth is there's something about the encounter between a man and a woman that tames and civilizes both, perhaps. And in this case, speaking of the men. Now, there is some evidence that this poem was not meant just for entertainment's sake. This poem was a part of the ritual of coming into manhood for a boy. It may have accompanied various steps to help the boy kind of be initiated into manhood, as a lot of cultures have. One of the great sad things, perhaps, about our culture is that we don't have some of these initiations to help boys know when they've moved into manhood. Now, I could think of some that do. You know, of course, one could think of the Aboriginal people where they have, what is it, the walkabout. We have some cultures where the man goes out and does his first hunt. I've often thought, when does a man know he's a man? In other classes, I've asked women, when is it that you know you're a woman? And I've had different answers. Some have argued, well, it's when you have your period, your first period. Some have argued that it's certainly when you begin to, when your body begins to make significant changes. Some cultures, like in Latin cultures, you'll have something like a quinceañera, which is a coming out party, but it's also a kind of sense of now the girl has become a woman. We have a bar mitzvah in Jewish culture, But in much of North America, we don't have that, and I think uh, men are hurt by that. I'm not even sure what the female equivalent is. That's perhaps a tragedy. Something I might throw in a discussion thread about this as well. But I've often wondered, why is it? What is it about the encounter between men and women that has a civilizing force on each other? Um, I've seen it happen. I've been, of course, as I've already mentioned, in the dorm when the guys are in there being crude as they often are, and then a woman walks in. They all change. I've seen a dormitory actually that was wild where I went to school, Sonoma State University. We had a guys' dorm that was completely out of control. We'd actually had 3 alcohol-related deaths in 1 year. They fixed that problem in an interesting way. They actually replaced the men's dean with a woman. So they had what they called a dean mother. And it was interesting because it fixed all the problems in the guys' dorm like that. Because for some reason, it was like having your mom in the dorm. And they all seemed to be better behaved. And it's interesting how even sometimes the wildest, roughest men won't show that side to their mother. One theory of that may cause this taming is that the men and the women want each other. They want each other physically, they want each other emotionally, they want each other often long-term, short-term, but they do want each other. And it doesn't take men long to realize that women aren't always attracted to the crude side of men. And so they change their behavior. And I'm not a woman, so I can't really comment on the female side. And I would love to hear those of you who are women to comment on this part about what is it about this that civilizes us. I think there certainly is that. There is a maturity level, but that maturity level also has to do with the need to settle down. And the settling down means I need to find a mate of some sort. And so you end up being a kind of taming to each other. It's interesting how throughout these centuries, even millennia, so much of the literature focuses, especially I think because most of the literature that we have, sadly, tragically, is written by men. And so we often have the male perspective. I think Gilgamesh is clearly a poem written from a masculine perspective. But I think that that's true with most of the literature we're going to look at because it's just sadly been the way it's been. We get a kind of masculine approach. And so we have women as something to be won. At times, something to be conquered, but something to be won. And this seems to be indicating a larger truth to this. I think what's kind of interesting about this is so much of what's in Gilgamesh resonates with what's in Genesis. When people discovered the book of Gilgamesh, they began to notice right away, it didn't take them long, this is the reason for the excitement, was how similar the accounts were in Gilgamesh to Genesis. You have a flood story, which we will talk about. I'm going to talk about that first thing next week. The flood stories that are too similar to be, not to be the same. And we have an account where we have a snake who ends up being the one taking away the eternal life. We have the creation story that is, at least has an echo of the Genesis story. And so much of it comes down to that idea of the masculine and the feminine. I've been very interested in that as a scholar, in particular because my area of interest has been in Genesis. And one of the things that has especially interested me is the opening part of Genesis. When I was working on my own particular translation of Genesis, I'm going to jump over here to it. and it's on page 48 of your syllabus. I was working on my translation, and I began to realize the challenge that comes with translating something from Hebrew to English, because English and Hebrew are so different. English, in the English-speaking world, I would argue, and I don't know, I think I would get some agreement on this, that the true religion of the English-speaking world and the Western world is law. We love law. And what is law but semantics, arguing over the meaning of words? When if you go before the Supreme Court and you argue a case, you're arguing semantics. What precisely did these men and later women mean when they wrote these words? And we're interpreting law. We're looking for precision in the meaning. For that reason, English is an enormous language, nearly 4 times as big as the second biggest language, because we want to know precisely what it means. Hebrew, on the other hand, is not like that. Hebrew actually is a small language, not a primitive language, just a smaller language, because the issue at hand is not always precision of meaning, but often the nuance of meaning. So you have to often have words and phrases that are being asked to mean more than one thing, and you tell the meaning from the context of what's going on. What do we do when sometimes the context doesn't help us, especially since we're looking into a distant past with a dead language there? Well, the ancient rabbis even encountered that, and they would argue that sometimes both ideas, or all 3 ideas, or all 4 ideas might be right. Well, let me give an example of this kind of a challenge of where it can lead you and why I think it's relevant to the discussion. So coming over here to Genesis, and this is toward the end of Genesis 1, and top of page 48, it says, and this is God talking, this is Elohim talking. Elohim is not his name, it's like our word God. It's kind of a generic word, God. So, and God says, let us craft an atom as a picture of us, similar to us, and let it dominate the sea fish and the sky birds and the livestock and the whole earth and every soil crawler that crawls on the earth. Now, I want you to notice one thing. Adam is not his name. The creature that God creates, that Elohim creates, his name is not Adam. That is what he is. He is Ha-Adam, the Adam. And it's meant to be kind of funny, actually. It's a pun on Adamah, which means the red dirt. So it's really meant to be kind of funny. He's creating this creature, this red dirt man. Now, one of the interesting things about Hebrew, too, is that it's a gendered language, like other Latin-based languages, Spanish, Latin, Italian, French, that are gendered languages. Hebrew is a gendered language, so each of the words are either masculine or feminine. English is not like that. And Adam is masculine, which is why it's a good translation if you want to say the man or the red dirt man. I like how Robert Alter, the great translator scholar, translated the earthling. I like that, although it sounds a little sci-fi. Probably a better translation, though. But it's definitely a masculine word, but it's a masculine word in the same way in English that our pronoun everyone or everybody is masculine. If I say everyone should go to his dorm, then you know I mean everyone, male and female, should go to his dorm. Now, we've since tried to change that because we don't have gender neutral pronouns. We just have his and her. Well, Adam is like that. And this is the reason why when the ancient rabbis and the ancient Hebrews read this, they were perplexed a little, because it says, let us craft Adam, this creature that can be male and female, because both a man and a woman can be Adam. And it says, and Elohim crafted the atom to be like himself. And he crafted, and I put it, because since it can be male or female, he crafted it as a picture of himself, and he crafted it both male and female. Now notice he crafts this creature male and female. Now, this is why a lot of ancient rabbinical texts have described Adam as both being male and female, as a kind of hermaphrodite. You'll even see some ancient Hebrew and Jewish texts with pictures in them where Adam has a beard, but also breasts, or sometimes even both masculine and feminine genitalia. And that's because they're reading this saying, well, he must be both. And so he creates this creature, and he creates it male and female. Now, again, I'm not saying that that is precisely what happened. What I am saying when I do my translation is that this is a legitimate translation. So you can see why it would be challenging from one who's translating it. Which way do I go? And my teachers, of course, required me to take the road less traveled. But I think this is interesting in perspective of the fact that when we get to chapter 2, we have this creature, and I'm going to scroll down here to page 49, and right about here, I don't know if you can see right here where my cursor is, you have Ha-Adam, and he's looking out and he sees the animals. He sees male and female. Every animal's got a buddy, except for himself. He doesn't have a buddy. And Adam is naming these creatures, but can't find a buddy for himself. And so right here, it says, and Yahweh Elohim. Now, Yahweh is a masculine name, so it means like Yahweh God said, it is not good. The Adam should not be alone. I will handcraft a helper as an equal. So Yahweh Elohim crafted from the soil the earth beasts and the sky birds and presented them to the Adam to see what it would call them. Whatever the Adam called out to a creature, that became its name. And the Adam called out names for livestock and for sky birds and for earth beasts, but it found no equal as its helper. So Yahweh Elohim cast a spell of drowsiness over the Adam, and it slept. And he removed from the Adam its side. Now notice I didn't translate it as its rib. Now its rib is a perfectly good translation, but the same word that we would use for rib can also be translated as his side. So it's like splitting him in half, if you will. So taking this creature and splitting him in half. So he takes this creature, splits him in half, and removes his side, closes the flesh. And so right here, and he removed from the Adam its side and then reclosed the flesh. And Yahweh Elohim handcrafted the Adam's side into a woman, and he presented her to the Adam. Now that's interesting, isn't it? But that if you have the idea that instead of just popping out a rib and creating another creature out of this bone, but you're actually having a creature that's now been split in half, well, that, of course, creates different interpretations, different ways of viewing this story, but that also makes this next passage perhaps make a little more sense, because you have Ha-Adam looking at the woman, and the Adam said, this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. So it's got my bone and my flesh. It's both. This will be called Isha, which means woman, because she was taken from Ish. So that passage there makes a little more sense, but perhaps even more so is this next kind of interesting insertion that it says, and that is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his woman, and they become one flesh. And they were both naked, the Adam and his woman, but they were unashamed. Now, here's the interesting part. If you're to take that idea of Adam and this creature that's made in the image of God as this creature that's male and female, and then gets split, and then that passage that says that's why the man will cling to the woman and they'll become one flesh. it seems to be actually hearkening quite literally to the idea that they will become again that singular creature that they once were when they were Ha-Adam, that they were this male and female creature. I told that to my wife once, and she said, "Oh, does that mean that are you arguing for soulmates?" No, I'm not even arguing that this is for sure what happened. All I'm saying is that it is a legitimate translation. Um, and to show how our stories create us. Imagine for a moment, if you will, not asking you to, I'm not asking you to accept that this is how it happened, but I am asking you to imagine if the story had been taught over the last few thousand years this way, that Adam is this male and female creature that gets split, how would that change the world's history? How would that change how we look at men and women? How would that change how we view marriage? How would that change how we view relationships in general? Would it change it significantly? I would say absolutely it would change it, because not only do our stories, do we in many ways affect our stories, but our stories affect us. We would be different people in a different world today if that's how the story was told. So I'm going to be asking you that question, and that is a little bit. That is, what does these stories tell us about the relationship between men and women, and how they affect us in some ways, and how might they be different if they were told differently? So anyway, I hope you're doing well. I hope you've been going through these. I hope it's not too dull just to listen to me pontificate in front of a computer. And I'd love to hear a little, not just response to the ideas, but to hear if it's working for you, because that gives me an idea. So we're both kind of learning together. But I'm going to go ahead and leave you now. I would really like you, if you have not finished reading Gilgamesh and Genesis, to read that. We're going to spend the beginning of next week finishing this up, talking about the flood. But I want you to put much of your energy into reading the Odyssey by Homer, because it's a long text, reading books 1 through 4 and 8 through 12. Not reading the whole book, just those books. We'll talk a little bit about that next week as well. Anyway, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you listening, and I'll talk to you real soon.